He felt the change first in the way the sea pulled at him. One moment, the worksite lay still under his helmet light, steel pipes and valves fading into the dark. The next, a harder drag tugged at his back, and the confident chatter in his headset gave way to clipped voices. 90 meters down in the North Sea, saturation diver Chris Lemons stopped what he was doing and turned toward the umbilical that tied him to life. The line leading away from his back carried everything: heliox breathing gas, hot water for his suit, power for his light and camera, and the cable that linked his voice to the bell and to dive control on the ship Bibi Topaz. When the vessel held position, that bundle of hoses hung with gentle slack. Now it stretched so tight he could feel the strain through the harness. Above him, a storm had shoved the ship off its mark, and the dynamic positioning system meant to correct for wind and waves had just failed. The order came fast: abort the job, get back to the bell. There were 3 divers in the water that night: Lemons, Duncan Alcock, and David Uasa. Alcock and Uasa were closer to the bell. Lemons was furthest out along the Huntington Field structure. He pushed off the frame, hands sliding along metal as his fins drove hard. The umbilical jerked again as the bell moved with the drifting ship, pulling away faster than any diver could swim. He tried to follow, hoping the line would clear whatever it had snagged on. Instead, the pull built to a steady, brutal drag. Then everything changed at once. His helmet light went out. The warmth in his suit vanished. The familiar background hiss and layered voices in his ears cut to silence. It felt, he would later say, as if someone had simply unplugged the sea. His umbilical had snapped. For the first time in his career, Chris Lemons was completely alone on the seabed. Training answered before panic could. He reached to his back, switched over to his bailout set, and felt the regulator give him a different, slightly stiffer breath. Every saturation diver knows the numbers. That small cylinder carries only a few minutes of gas at working rate, and less if you start to fight and breathe hard. He clipped himself to the nearby manifold so the current could not sweep him away, and forced his lungs into a slow, controlled rhythm. Up above, the team watched his video feed vanish. They could still see Alcock and Uasa. They could still track the bell. But Lemons's picture fell to black, and his data flatlined. In the control room, no one had to say what that meant. A snapped umbilical at 90 meters gave a diver only his bailout and his training. On the bridge and in the engine spaces, crew fought to restart the thrusters manually and drive Bibi Topaz back over the point where he had been working. On the bottom, he knew none of that. The world had shrunk to the hiss of each breath and the dim halo from his helmet light. Swimming blind for the bell would only waste what little gas he had, so he stayed clipped to the steel and tried to ride out the minutes. Each inhalation grew harder, the suit around him turned to cold rubber, and numbness crept into his hands and feet as the North Sea stripped away his warmth. When it happened, there was no warning tone. He drew in, expecting resistance from the regulator, and got nothing. Instinct made him suck harder, but the bottle was empty. His chest spasmed, trying to haul in gas that was no longer there. Panic surged, and then thinned into a strange calm. There was no valve left to turn, no forgotten drill. He thought briefly of his fiancée waiting ashore, felt his vision narrow, and then everything went dark. Up above, the clocks in dive control kept running. Engineers bypassed the failed dynamic positioning system and shifted to manual thruster control, wrestling the ship back toward the worksite through wind and swell. In the meantime, an ROV slid down through the dark, its camera sweeping across the manifold where Lemons had been working. After tense minutes, the monitor in the control room showed a diver fixed to the structure lying on his side, umbilical trailing away into the black. By the time they found him, more than 30 minutes had passed since the umbilical snapped. On paper, the man on the screen had been dead for a long time. But procedure and loyalty demanded more than a video confirmation. When the ship was close enough, Yuasa left the bell again, following guidelines and the ROV's light until he reached the still figure. He wrapped his arms around Lemons's body and began the exhausting swim back, dragging the dead weight of a diver in full gear along the seabed. Inside the bell, Alcock helped pull Lemons through the hatch and lay him on the metal floor. They stripped off his helmet. His skin was pale, his eyes unresponsive. Nobody could find a pulse. There was no crash cart or monitor, just a cramped chamber under pressure and two divers staring at a friend who looked beyond saving. Alcock pinched his nose, sealed his mouth over Lemons's, and began forcing gas into lungs that had been empty on the seabed. After several rounds with no reaction, he stopped, convinced it was over. Then he tried one more time. This time, Lemons gasped. The sound was small, but in the bell it felt like someone had thrown open a door. His chest rose. A faint pulse returned under their fingers. Alcock and Yuasa looked at each other, stunned. Against everything they knew about diving medicine, the man they thought they had recovered as a body was breathing again. Back inside the saturation system, supervisors and medics braced for the worst. A brain starved of oxygen for more than a few minutes is supposed to come back damaged, if at all. Yet over the next hours and days, Lemons woke up in steps, following commands, recognizing voices, and recalling the job. Scans later showed no permanent injury. He had spent more than half an hour cut off from his lifeline and somehow escaped the damage the textbooks predicted. Specialists still argue about how he lasted so long. Cold water slowing his body, high oxygen at depth, and the pressure itself are the most common guesses. But even they admit none of it quite adds up. For Lemons, the technical arguments mattered less than the memories that stayed. He remembered the growing effort of each breath, the moment the regulator went dry, and the strange calm that followed when he accepted there was nothing more to do. Back on land, he had to sit with his fiancée and describe the night he had been sure he would never see her again. He talked with investigators and safety experts, walking them through the failure so future divers might not face the same risk. Weeks later, he went back offshore. He returned to the chambers and bells, working as a diver and then as a supervisor, carrying a story that became required listening in briefing rooms across the industry. Eventually, the wider world heard it too, through the documentary Last Breath and later a dramatized film, both built around the same fact that had stunned his own colleagues. On a stormy night in September 2012, a saturation diver working 300 feet down lost his lifeline, switched to a tiny emergency bottle, and waited in the dark as his air ran out and his body shut down. 30-plus minutes after the connection to the surface snapped, his friends pulled what they thought was a corpse into the bell and gave him one last round of rescue breaths. Somehow, impossibly, Chris Lemons came back. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.